Hi, this is Christy Sprague from Michigan State University, and today we're going to talk a little bit about soybean trait confusion. As we all know, there's a number of different herbicide-resistant soybean traits available, so I thought today what we would do is kind of run through the different traits, look at some of the advantages and some of the potential pitfalls with these traits, and kind of give you a few key lookouts as we look towards the next season in choosing the soybean trait that you would like to plant. So what I have here is a list of current commercialized soybean traits that are available. And what I thought I would first do is just quickly mention non-GMO soybeans, because we still do have a few growers that are growing non-GMO soybeans. There are a few different benefits to growers that are using non-GMO soybeans, and one of those is a lot of times we do see a crop selling premium, and sometimes we can see upwards of $1.50 to $1.75 per bushel extra for some of those growers that are fitting into some of these specialty markets. Typically, we see a little bit lower seed cost when we're growing non-GMO soybeans. But a few of the setbacks that you run into is a lot of times we're using older genetics. So maybe some of the disease packages or soybeans cyst nematode packages aren't there. And the other thing that we deal with is in those fields that have herbicide resistant weeds, we definitely limit our choices on herbicides that we can use to control them. Where we see non-GMO soybeans fit is when growers do not have major herbicide resistant weed problems. And generally, when we have growers that are growing non-GMO soybeans, we usually tell them it's best to grow them in conventional tillage systems, because that really helps decrease some of the horseweed or mare's tail problems that we might see in some of those fields. So now that we've got non-GMO soybeans out of the way, let's take a look at some of the different herbicide-resistant traits that we have in soybeans. So what I have here is kind of a timeline of when each one of these traits came into the market. And what this is kind of biotech soybean acres as a percentage over time. So our first herbicide-resistant soybean trait that was commercialized was Roundup Ready soybeans. And we know that this has been a very popular trait over the years. And you can see from 1996 that it didn't take too long for us to be upwards of 80–90% of our soybeans being grown with the Roundup Ready trait. In 2009, that's when the LibertyLink soybeans came on, as well as a second generation of Roundup Ready soybeans. And as we move further on, you can see that in 2017, Roundup Ready 2 Xtend soybeans were introduced into the market, as well as LibertyLink GT27 soybeans showing up in 2019. 2020, we see the Enlist E3 soybeans, and then this last year in 2021, we see the Xtend Flex soybeans being introduced into the market. So as you can look at this slide, over our soybean acres in the United States, we're well over 90% growing soybeans that have some sort of herbicide-resistant trait. So let's take a look and kind of go through each one of these soybean traits in chronological order. So first, let's look at the Roundup Ready soybeans. Obviously, these are soybeans that were resistant to Roundup or glyphosate, and we know that there are several different types of formulations of glyphosate available that growers can use. And as I mentioned before, our first Roundup Ready soybeans were first introduced in 1996, and then with a second generation coming out in 2009. So why did farmers start to plant Roundup Ready soybeans? Well, first of all, with glyphosate, we all know that it is non-selective for weed control, particularly for both broadleaf and grass weed species. And one of the things that was a major benefit is growers only needed to apply one herbicide, glyphosate. Glyphosate tended to control larger weeds and really made for a much ease of use for growers who were trying to control weeds in soybean. One of the other things that was a major benefit is we were starting to see a widespread of resistance to many of the herbicides that were commonly used in soybeans. At that time, herbicides like Pursuit were used on a large number of our soybean acres, and ALS resistance was becoming very widespread. So when Roundup Ready soybean came along, that really gave growers a great option for controlling a lot of those ALS resistant weed species. And here's just kind of an example of where we were on a timeline of number of unique herbicide resistant weed cases. And this is some information that was pulled down from the International Survey of Herbicide Resistant Weeds, Dr. Ian Heap's website. And as you can see, we have a large increase in the number of herbicide resistant weeds over time. And as you look at this, you can really start to see where that increase was occurring. And when Roundup Ready soybeans came in, that really gave us another option for controlling those herbicide resistant weeds. And again, this was prior to any glyphosate resistant weeds being identified. If we look at that same timeline and we look at how these were broken down by some of the different herbicide sites of action, you can see the blue line being the PS2 inhibitors. So those are things like atrazine, metribuzin. And as I said, ALS inhibitor or ALS resistance was really becoming on the rise. So when those Roundup Ready soybeans came in, that really did help manage some of those different herbicide resistant weeds. So then we have glyphosate resistant weeds. So, the Roundup Ready soybean system worked really well, but when we started to see the breakdown, a lot of these glyphosate resistant weeds started to show up. And as you can see here, this is just kind of a listing of the 16 different glyphosate resistant weeds that have been found in the US. And you can see the different squares for where a lot of these glyphosate resistant weeds are found. So in the case of Michigan, where I'm from, we have 5 different species that are resistant to glyphosate in Michigan. And you can see, looking at maybe where you're from in some of those states, where you may have anywhere from 1 to maybe upwards of 9 different species that are resistant to glyphosate. So with that, we needed to have some option to control those glyphosate resistant weeds. So in 2009, LibertyLink soybeans were registered on the market. LibertyLink soybeans are resistant to the herbicide glufosinate. Mostly glufosinate is sold as Liberty, but there are some other trade names that are available with the active ingredient glufosinate. As I mentioned, these came out in 2009. However, we really didn't have a lot of glyphosate resistance at that time. So LibertyLink soybeans were a little bit slower on the adoption side than what we saw with Roundup Ready soybeans. However, over the last 10 years or so, we've really started to see an increase in the number of LibertyLink soybean acres planted and Liberty used for weed control. And some of the benefits for that is it does provide another option for non-selective weed control of both broadleaf and grass weeds. And it does provide alternatives for management of both glyphosate and multiple resistant weed species. Some of the challenges with the Liberty system is that when we use Liberty or glufosinate, it is quite different than using glyphosate or Roundup, even though both of them are non-selective. Currently, we know that there are 2 weed species in the US that are resistant to glufosinate. And really, when we're using LibertyLink soybeans for weed control, a systems approach is required. So let's look at some of the differences between glyphosate or Roundup and glufosinate Liberty. So when we look at glyphosate, you'll see some of these numbers and on the side, and those are our site of action numbers. So glyphosate is a herbicide site of action group 9. It is non-selective. It is systemic. So that means it's going to be much better on perennials and biennial weed species. The way glyphosate works is it is applied to the plant, it translocates through the plant, and usually within about 10 to 14 days, we start to see the plant start out turning yellow, and then it'll turn brown and die within that 10 to 14 days. However, with the glufosinate, It is also non-selective. It is a contact herbicide. And because it's contact, we need to make sure that that herbicide covers the whole leaf surface. And in general, we recommend that you use spray volumes of greater than 15 gallons per acre for coverage. What we generally see is we start to see some symptomology within the first day or so, and they really show up as rapid tissue necrosis and then quickly plant death. The one thing about Liberty that's a little bit different than glyphosate is it is generally weaker on grasses and also common lamb's quarters. And optimum sizes for weed heights is usually 2 to 3 inches tall. A lot of times as those weeds get bigger, they're a lot tougher to control with glufosinate as compared to glyphosate. One of the other key things to know is that glufosinate or Liberty alone is not always effective. This is from a trial that we had where we sprayed 32 ounces of Liberty plus AMS. You can see not all the weeds are dead. Part of the problem is when you have a thick canopy of weeds, a lot of times you do not get the adequate coverage that you need to control all those weeds. So it's much better when we are dealing with sparser weed populations. Another thing that happens is glufosinate does not have any residual activity, very similar to what you see with glyphosate. So when I talk about systems approaches, what I'm really talking about is making sure that we're using good soil applied or pre-emergence herbicides to help manage some of those weeds. So when we come back with Liberty, we're just cleaning up some of the weed escapes. So you can see this is from the same trial. This is using an effective pre-emergence herbicide and then making a Liberty application. And you can see the big differences between each one of these treatments. The next herbicide-resistant soybean trait that I'd like to talk about is the Roundup Ready to Xtend soybean system. Roundup Ready to Xtend soybeans are resistant not only to glyphosate, but also to Dicamba. These were first introduced in 2017. So what these soybeans did is basically provided us another option to control, again, glyphosate and multiple resistant broadleaf weed species. And this is really as we start to see that glyphosate resistance expand across the United States, as well as many of these weed species being resistant to more than just glyphosate. So what do we need to know about Roundup Ready to Xtend soybean? Well, one of the important things is to make sure that when we're using Dicamba in Roundup Ready to Xtend soybeans is to know that we can only use registered Dicamba formulations. Currently, we have 2 Dicamba formulations that are registered. These are Extendamax and Ingenia. There is also one premix that is registered, and that is Tavium, and that is Dicamba plus S-metolachlor. With Dicamba-resistant soybeans, they are not resistant to any other group 4 herbicides. So for example, here's a slide showing Dicamba applied to Roundup Ready to Xtend soybeans. We also applied 2,4-D to Roundup Ready to Xtend soybeans and Status. As you can see, both Status and 2,4-D have significantly injured to the point to where those soybeans will die. So again, there is no cross resistance. The only group 4 herbicide that can be applied across Roundup Ready to Xtend soybeans is Dicamba. Another thing to note is that Dicamba only controls broadleaf weeds. Currently, there are 3 weed species in the US that are resistant. There are also several sensitive plant species to Dicamba. And a lot of these also include non-Dicamba resistant soybeans. So this is one of the things that we really need to think about. So as you can see, we've got some leaf cupping of soybeans here. And this is basically low rates of Dicamba on non-Xtend soybeans, so non-Dicamba resistant soybeans. And we can see this can be an issue. In addition to non-resistant soybeans, we can also see issues with other sensitive plants like tomatoes, tobacco, sugar beets, dry beans, several tree species, as well as grapes. So oftentimes, some of the concerns that we have is with Dicamba applications, especially close to those Xtend soybeans is you can tend to see fields that have cupped leaves in the soybeans. And those can be caused by drift, volatility, and tank contamination. While these are major concerns, the Dicamba system can be useful, particularly if we're applying it early. But there are also several precautions to reduce Dicamba injury. And a lot of these are listed and are very important to follow on the Dicamba labels. And here are a few highlights to think about. Making sure that you're using registered products for the registered uses, making sure you're staying within that application window. When we're using a lot of these registered Dicamba formulations, we need to make sure that we're using a drift reducing agent as well as a volatility reducing agent. We also want to make sure that we do not use ammonium sulfate or any AMS, as that can also increase volatility from Dicamba. Nozzle selection, wind speed, travel speed, boom height are also very important to keep in mind when you're applying Dicamba. And it's also important to make sure that you're aware of your surrounding area, especially for adjacent sensitive crops and plants. One of the things I'd like to highlight is the downwind buffer. If we're applying Dicamba in Xtend soybeans, we need to keep in mind that we need to keep a buffer. And I thought I'd provide an example of how that works. So with Dicamba applications, we need to make sure that we have a 240-foot downwind buffer. And what I mean from that is if we look at this field, you can see here that if the wind is coming from the east and blowing towards the west, we would have a buffer on the west side. So we'd want to make sure that we keep an area that is a buffer. And these are to our Roundup Ready to Xtend soybeans. Another thing to keep in mind is if you have that Roundup Ready to Xtend soybeans and the field next door or adjacent is non-Xtend soybeans, you would make sure that you do not apply. So it's important to know that the buffer is there when there is not a sensitive crop nearby. It's also to make sure that we do not have any drift. So if the wind is blowing towards a sensitive crop like a non-Xtend soybean or dry beans, we would make sure that we do not apply the Dicamba formulation at that time. When we look at the different systems for using the Roundup Ready to Xtend system, here are a couple pictures. So what we have is glyphosate-resistant horseweed or mare's tail. On the left-hand side, you can see there are two applications of Roundup Power Max and basically has not touched the mare's tail present in that field. In this situation, we used Roundup plus Xtend plus metribuzin as a good residual. That Xtend controlled any of the Dicamba, or excuse me, mare's tail that was up at that time. The metribuzin helped along with the Xtend to make sure that we had some good residual control. And then we followed it up with an Xtend plus Roundup application and had very good results throughout the season. We've also done this where we've had good incorporation of both the metribuzin and the Xtend, and in some cases have not needed to include the Xtend in the post-emergence application. It is important to make sure that you're always using just the registered Dicamba products, and then make sure that you're always looking at those labels because those labels are dynamic and they should always be checked prior to use. The next thing I wanted to mention is the LibertyLink GT27 soybeans. These soybeans first came to the market in 2019. These soybeans were our first commercialized soybean variety where both glufosinate and glyphosate, so Liberty and Roundup, could be applied post-emergence. With that, there were some questions. First of all, could we apply these two products together in a soybean system? One of the things that we have seen under certain conditions with certain weed species is you can see a slight antagonism. If you look at this picture, you can see our grass control with Roundup Power Max was 100%. If we look at Liberty, it was about 80%. If we applied Liberty plus Roundup, we would get better control than Liberty alone, but slightly less than Roundup. So again, with some weed species, we might see some antagonisms, and sometimes that occurs with grasses. We have seen that there are benefits when we do apply these for things like glyphosate-resistant water hemp, glyphosate-resistant mare's tail, and also glyphosate-resistant palmer amaranth. So here's just another example. This is with water hemp, Roundup Power Max at 32 ounces, Liberty at 32 ounces alone, the combination. And again, really remembering that we need to look at a systems approach whenever we're looking at many of these different herbicide traits. So again, that effective pre is extremely important. One other thing with the LibertyLink GT27, these soybeans are also resistant to the herbicide isoxaflutol, which is called Elite 27. Elite 27 can be applied early pre-plant incorporated, or pre-emergence. However, there's very little use of this herbicide since it's only registered in certain counties of certain states. So it's just kind of one of those additional things, but these herbicides are mostly used for both their glyphosate and glufosinate resistance. And this is really important as we start looking at trying to control some different weeds. One other issue that we have is multiple resistant herbicide weeds. So we can look at some examples for Michigan. They're not always have to be just glyphosate resistance with some other things, but you can see we have some traits like, or some weeds like Palo amaranth that might be resistant to both atrazine and an ALS inhibitor. And you can see some of these other weeds that have glyphosate and ALS resistance. And in some cases, a third resistance like trizine resistance or PPO resistance like group 14. And you can see in some other states where there are some different weed species like water hemp that can have up to 5 or 6 herbicide resistant traits that can be found in some of these different weeds. So it's important to think about how do we effectively manage some of these multiple resistant weeds. So what are effective post-emergence options? So if we look at non-GMO and Roundup Ready soybeans, when we have glyphosate resistance or multiple resistant weeds, we basically have no post-emergence options. When we look at the traits of LibertyLink, Roundup Ready 2 Xtend, or the LibertyLink GT27, we're basically left with one herbicide resistant, or excuse me, one site of action that would control those weeds. And as we start looking at some of these newer technologies like Enlist E3 soybeans or Xtend Flex soybeans, we would actually have 2 effective herbicide sites of action. So with the Enlist E3 soybeans, we would have a group 4 and a group 10, so Liberty, and in this case, 2,4-D. And with the Xtend Flex soybeans, we're looking at both Liberty and Dicamba that could be used to control glyphosate and multiple resistant weeds. So when we have a lot of multiple resistant weeds that we're dealing with, sometimes it's best to look at some of these ones where we can have 2 effective herbicide sites of action available. And those would include the Enlist E3 soybeans and the Xtend Flex soybeans. So let's look at these. Enlist E3 soybeans first came on the market in 2020. And again, we have resistance to 3 different herbicides, the 2,4-D choline salt. We also have glufosinate and glyphosate. Similar to what we saw with the Xtend soybeans, we do not see cross resistance to other group 4 herbicides. So we cannot apply Dicamba to these soybeans. What this does, it allows for 2 effective post-herbicide options to control both glyphosate and multiple resistant weeds. There are also some concerns with off-target injury to sensitive crops because of the 2,4-D. However, and there are some additional restrictions for growers to use, but a lot of these restrictions are not as many as what we might see with Dicamba for the use with Xtend soybeans. For example, with Enlist 1, which is the 2,4-D choline salt formulation by itself, and Enlist Duo, which is the premixture with glyphosate, we do need to allow for a 30-foot downwind buffer to sensitive areas. And we also have that caveat of not applying it if the wind is blowing towards adjacent commercially grown tomatoes and other fruiting vegetables, cucurbits, and grapes. Here are some examples of what happens when you can look at 2 effective herbicide sites of action. So this is with glyphosate-resistant palmer amaranth. We have Roundup Ready Power Max in the upper left-hand corner, Enlist Duo, which would be the combination of the choline salt of 2,4-D plus glyphosate. We have Liberty by itself in the lower left-hand corner. And then you can see what happens when we have two herbicide sites of action that are effective, the Liberty plus Enlist 1. And many times when we apply two effective sites of action, we get more consistent and better control. So finally, I'd just like to say a few things about Xtend Flex soybeans. These are just recently became available in 2021. These are resistant to Dicamba, glyphosate, and glufosinate. What this does provides additional options for post-glyphosate resistant weed control. The one thing, because we are using Dicamba, off-target injury is still a concern. So with that, I'd just like to mention a few take-home messages from this presentation. Regardless of what soybean trait that you're using, it's very important to integrate multiple weed management techniques. Some of these things are making sure that we start clean so we don't have any early season weed competition, applying pre-emergence residual herbicides, making sure that we're using timely post-herbicide applications, which could also include a residual product or tank mixture with that post-application. So things like some of the group 15 herbicides, using multiple sites of action, both pre and post, making sure that we scout for any of those weed escapes. And some other considerations to think about are some of the cultural practices, including planting cover crops in the fall, deep tillage, planting in narrow row spacings, and even at higher seed populations to make sure that we have early canopy closure. One other thing to keep in mind is when you're using a lot of these different herbicide-resistant soybean traits, make sure that you keep track of good planting records so you know where those fields are. It's important to make sure that there is not the wrong herbicide being applied to the wrong herbicide-resistant soybean trait. And most importantly, always read and follow herbicide label instructions. For more information on some of these different soybean traits, you can go to the iwilltakeaction.com website and download a couple of the different fact sheets on each one of these traits. With that, we will leave you and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.